Let us bow in prayer. Gracious and loving God, your eternal creative spirit is always at work bringing life. Your love is always near, seeking to hold us in your close embrace. Help us to be open to you each day. Help us to be open to you in a special way in these next few moments, and may you be pleased to use my words, all of our thoughts, all of our meditations. Through them and in spite of them, we be drawn closer to you, gain an added measure of your love and of your truth. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Have you ever played the game Risk? It is a board game that involves a map of the world with arbitrary markings that have borders that label each of the imaginary countries or territories of the world. So there's a segment, for instance, that's Western Canada, another one that's Western Europe or China or Southern Africa, etc. And you play the game by placing armies on all the territories that you were assigned at the opening of the game. And the goal of the game is to capture other territories, conquer the world. Now the sad thing is, this game of conquering is what we used to play at Christmas time in my house with the kids. When we celebrate the birth of the Prince of Peace, we conquered the world. But anyway, you conquer the world by challenging a border territory to a battle. And you and the defender each shake dice, and the one with the higher number wins, meaning sometimes you conquer, sometimes the defender wins and you lose. I first played this game when I lived in residence in the University of Regina when I was about 19 or 20. And when I was in university, the quad, that part of the residence where several of us lived, had this game going, and one winter it went on for several days because we kept changing people. As a person had to go to class or somebody had to go to bed, someone else would replace them. And the game kept going. Now at one point, I had lost all my territories except for the Congo in Africa. And my territory was so small, I really couldn't attack anyone else. But for a day or two, if anyone attacked me, somehow I always defeated them and remained in my territory. It became a marvel of the group that I could resist the siege and the onslaught of the armies. Well, in Isaiah today, we have an ancient prophecy that was used centuries later by Christians to understand the significance of the birth of Jesus. And the context is about a people under siege. In Isaiah's time, King Ahaz is the king of a separate kingdom called Judea, which is where Jerusalem is located. The northern kingdom, called Israel, is separate, and it's allied with the king of Aram, and they both want to conquer Judea, replace King Ahaz, and with a puppet king who will support their goal of a coalition against the Assyrian Empire. So Jerusalem is under siege, which means they are surrounded by foreign armies, they're cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and as in all sieges, they are being left to starve, to run out of supplies before the assailing army moves in for the final assault. Now sometimes a siege would last for months, maybe years. I think probably it's like a blockade, I suppose, or maybe a modern equivalent would be sanctions leveled against a nation trying to crush its economy to force it to change policy. However, in a siege, as a water supply might be compromised, as crops cannot get into the city, as food stocks dwindle, citizens starve. Health issues are more serious with a lack of food or medicine. Children and the elderly are the first to die and not survive a crippling siege. The message of Isaiah 7 today begins by Isaiah challenging King Ahaz to trust in God and ask for a sign of hope and promise that he and Judea will survive this siege. Now Ahaz doesn't do that. He really doesn't trust God, but rather than deny God, he simply wraps himself in pious words and says we should not test God. So the prophet Isaiah, which Karen read for us, responds by saying, even though Ahaz will not ask God, God will provide a sign anyway. And the sign is that a young woman who's with child will give birth in this time of siege and suffering, and this child will not only live, an amazing thing in itself, but before this child is weaned, the kings that threaten will be gone, and the nation survive. So the message is, so have hope. Trust in God, for this child will be called Emmanuel, meaning God is with us. Now, we don't know who this woman was they're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years ago, before Christ was born. Scholars say it could be Ahaz's wife, mother of the future king Hezekiah. Could be Isaiah's wife, who gave birth to other children, and they also named them with prophetic names, like this one, Emmanuel, God with us. Now, when this passage was translated into ancient Greek and formed a very important and influential translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, the Bible used by the early Christians, the word young woman in Hebrew, which means a woman of marriageable age, was translated as virgin in Greek. And when Matthew and others read this passage about the sign of the birth of a child to a virgin, a young woman, and this child would be Emmanuel, God with us, well, Matthew and others saw it fulfilled in the experience of the birth of Jesus to Mary, a child from God, a child of the Holy Spirit, a child of whom God was fully present. Now, although the prophecy of Isaiah was originally not about Jesus, the meaning and the spiritual insight of the ancient prophecy was applied to the birth of Jesus by Christian teachers and preachers centuries later. The ancient promise that the prophecy talked about of a sign of hope in a time of oppressive siege and hopelessness spoke to our Christian ancestors like Matthew and helped them articulate and understand the significance of Jesus and his life that had touched theirs so profoundly. And they read that passage and said, this is exactly what we're experiencing in Jesus. Now, some people find it hard to believe in the literal interpretation of the birth of Jesus, while others find it a core part of belief. There's also a third option which is important. It involves all the other options of how to understand the birth stories of Jesus, which is that this sacred story from our faith about Jesus' birth speaks to a powerful truth about the significance of Jesus and who he is and what he means. Remember, there are only two places in the Bible that speak about the birth of Jesus, Matthew and Luke. Each story is different, but each story attempts to portray a powerful truth that's the same. That Jesus is from God, that Jesus is a special child of the Spirit of God. Jesus is fully human. Jesus is a child that has a purpose to fulfill the prophecies of old. Jesus is the one who will bring saving freedom and life, healing of brokenness, and the gift of a new reality of life in union with God's life-giving presence. And so the meaning I'd encourage us to focus on today from these passages, these ancient stories of faith, is what we see in this sign of the birth of the child called Emmanuel, God with us. And what we see, I would suggest, is that whenever we are under siege in life, like Isaiah's people were under siege, God comes to us through this Christ to free us, to save us, to heal us, to grant us life. Have you ever felt under siege? By that I mean, have you ever felt boxed in life? Not knowing where to go, not knowing how to get help, not knowing how you will overcome the trials, the struggles, the losses, the hurts, the agonies you know. At this time of year in particular, many people feel under siege, in the sense that in their world, the cultural Christmas ideal of many gifts of love and joy, peace and hope, filling all relationships, the ability to be with family and friends, to know joy and wonder, the magic of the season, all of that is really something you only see on TV, but not in real life. I was working along with many others of you this week on the Community Christmas Hamper program. And in the conversations with those who worked at the program and those who were receiving, you hear many stories. And some of the stories are about how some would say, this is the loneliest time of year, cut off from family. Others would say it's stressful as they try to keep up to the expectations of food prepared, gifts wrapped, parties and obligations achieved. And still others speak about how it's been a tough Christmas because the year has been tough. Loss of health, dramatic loss of income, a crisis of family relationships, financial or job loss, things that box them in. And all these things I heard about this week are what it's like to be under siege. It happens at Christmas, it happens all through the year, and it happens at different times in our lives. The teaching of the scriptures is that the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem long ago is about more than a wonderful story, a heartwarming experience of looking at a child entering the world. Jesus is the sign of God's determined love to be with us. Jesus is the sign that God refuses to be a presence in divine reality that is beyond this world, separated from human life and experience. Jesus is the sign that God is with us. Just like so many times in our faith story, God has been with the real people and entered history in a profound way. Think of the stories. Calling Abraham and Sarah to found a family that would bless the world. Freeing Hebrew slaves from Egypt. Guiding Moses and the Israelites to a promised land. Giving hope and healing to the poor and suffering through the adult Jesus. Defeating death and injustice through the resurrection of the Christ. So when we come to this part of our sacred story of faith, about the God who comes to all of us who have ever lived under siege by life circumstances, who have ever felt boxed in, options cut off, hope denied, who have ever been overwhelmed by life's hardships, disappointments, injustices, losses, and sorrows, our faith says in response to all that, trust. Trust in this God who says, I am with you always. Trust in this God who comes in a real baby born in Bethlehem. Trust in this God who says, I am the God who promises a freeing and life-giving, death and injustice defeating love, and live in hope. Even when we're under siege, if we can have hope that there will be a way out one day that will be found, that even when we're under siege, if we can have hope that this too will end what we're going through, that we are not alone, that we are loved and not forgotten, that we can live more fully, that we can live more authentically, that we can live in spite of the sieges of life that surround us, if we can do that, then we know the gift of life. I remember many, many years ago when the United Church had made a decision very publicly in the denomination. It was very controversial. And there was much criticism and controversy inside the denomination and also from society and the community around it. I found it a stressful time as a minister because of that. And I thought, I'm at the beginning of my ministry. How will this work out, this controversy? What will happen? What can I do? How will I cope? And then, as happens each year, I received in the mail my annual statement about my pension plan from the United Church. And it said at that time that I could retire early 30 years from that date. I was so excited. I remember running upstairs from my office in the manse and saying, Anna, I can retire in 30 years. It was a sign of hope for me that the siege of stress I was feeling would end, even if it lasted for another 30 years, which of course it did not. That sign of hope was what I needed in order to do what I needed to do. And what I needed to do was to be a minister, do my job, trust in God, do my best to care for and serve the church and community and live out my faith and grow in my evolving understanding of how to do all that, and to be a husband and to be a father, to be a friend, to be part of the community. I am not alone, my faith says. God holds all of us in a loving embrace. God walks with us in life's ups and downs. God challenges and comforts, guides and prods us into a way of living and life, love and hope that is transformative for my life and for the world around me. Whenever we feel under siege, boxed in, trapped, alone, vulnerable, hopeless, look to the sign of Emmanuel, God with us. Trust in the presence of the Christ who promised to be with us always through the Spirit. Trust in the vision of God for life and world made whole. Live, even if that means only continuing to breathe in and out until you find the strength to do something more. As individuals, or as a church, or as a community, or as a world, Isaiah and Matthew remind us that Jesus is not just another baby in a world with millions of babies, as wonderful as each birth is. But Jesus is the sign that God has decided to be part of our life and our world, and to free us from all that traps us and keeps us under siege. When we remember that, and rely upon this and build our life around this truth, then the meaning and the significance of Christ's birth becomes real in us. Amen. Let us turn to the